On the 30th anniversary of the passing away of the founder of Iran's Islamic Republic, Imam Khomeini, the current leader of Iran, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, has spoken. When it came to holding talks with the U.S., he said that is absolutely out of the question. He also added that the reason behind that is due to the fact that these are not something that Iran is going to be fooled by. In this edition of the debate, we will look at some of the statements made by Iran's leader and also look at why the U.S. has changed its aggressive posturing when it comes to Iran and how that sits with some of its allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Joining us for this edition of the debate, Senior Fellow at Middle East Institute, Randa Slim, joins us from Washington, D.C. And we have investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who joins us from Bristol. I'd like to welcome you both. Tony Gosling, let me first start with you. Iran's leader has said that there will be no talks with the U.S. He said that Trump's offer of negotiations with Iran will not deceive Tehran. This perhaps may have come when the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that talks with no preconditions is something that the U.S. is open to. How do you see Iran's leader's statement there?
Well, I think in context, the relationship has been very fraught between Iran and the United States for many, many years. And what's happened over probably the last decade, culminating with Obama and the nuclear deal, is that there's been a big attempt to normalize that relationship. But since President Trump arrived on the scene, and particularly since Pompeo took over as Secretary of State, this normal relationship, in big inverted commas, the attempt to normalize it under Obama has been stripped away and stripped away. And now we're back to open war of words, saber rattling by the United States, and also, of course, their allies Israel and Saudi Arabia. So I think what we've seen is a slow stripping away of the attempts by some to create peace. I think in a way this is an inevitable conflict at some point in the future. It seems to me that the forces in the West, which have now got their hands on our previously used to be democracies, have decided that this conflict is going to happen at some point. And so they're edging towards it and edging towards it. And what bothers me more than anything else is that not only will some of the arms companies make massive amounts from such a conflict, but it seems to me the political leaders think that they can also gain support by having this kind of conflict. They will try and paint themselves as the good guys, getting rid of the terrorists supporting Iran, which of course is a lie, but they believe that with the help of the mass media that they can try and paint themselves as the good guys, when actually they could even be starting a third world war. So I think that's where we're coming to now. The forces in the West have come together. I mean, Britain, for example, we've got a zombie prime minister. There's really nobody running the country at the moment. And yet we've got a state visit by Donald Trump, which is a military level visit. That is between the top people in both countries, not really the politicians. And then, so they're very, very close, I think, to having some kind of a bigger conflict in the Middle East. Having been beaten back in Syria, they're not going away. And I can understand why the Iranian president wants them to and is giving that signal. But so long as the political leaders in the West think that they can gain in any way, whether it's financially or through credibility, I'm afraid this conflict is coming closer all the time.
Okay, well, that kind of goes in stark contrast to the way that the U.S. seems to have toned down its rhetoric. But Randa Slim, let me elaborate more a little bit about what Michael Pompeo has said about talks with no preconditions. He actually said the U.S. is prepared to engage with Iran without preconditions, but needs to see the country behaving like, quote, a normal nation. What does Pompeo mean when he says, quote, a normal nation?
I think what Pompeo is trying to do is to create a space for negotiation, but at the same time keep the room open for backing away from negotiations if Trump decides he doesn't want to negotiate, or if Iran does something, or if the allies of the US put too much pressure on the US not to engage in negotiation. I have to say that I strongly believe that neither side, not in Iran, not in the US, not in Gulf countries, not even Israel, wants a military escalation today. And I don't think they want it in the near future. They understand this is going to be a tragedy for everybody involved. Today, we heard news that the warship, the aircraft carrier, which was sent by the American administration to the Gulf, has stayed outside the Gulf, has not entered the Strait of Hormuz on purpose because they don't want to create any room, any space for accident that can escalate into a military escalation. I think Pompeo's words were meant to de-escalate the tension, but at the same time, not to go all the way toward negotiation because of the debate that is ongoing in the United States, inside the White House, between the White House and the State Department, between some elements of Congress and the White House, about what are we going to do with Iran. Look, this is a relationship, meaning the relationship between the United States and Iran has now been a relationship of mistrust for the past 40 years. There has been hostility. There has been acts that are seen by both sides as being, you know, beyond the normal, not acceptable, violence in some cases. There is definitely the US misgivings about Iranian support of different groups in the Middle East and its involvement, its regional policies. But Trump, again, the decider on foreign policy in this country is the president. And the president has made it more time and again clear what he wants. He wants negotiations. He wants a deal. And it could be the not too much different from the JCPOA deal. I mean, look at what he has done with NAFTA, with Canada and Mexico. The new deal that they negotiated, or that Trump negotiated and now is boasting as his deal, is pretty much NAFTA minus maybe 1%. So I think that, you know, it is worth testing Trump. So that's why I don't understand the position, the harsh position that has been taken by the Iranian leadership about not entering into negotiation. And maybe there is room for some indirect negotiations. Oman can serve as an intermediary. The Swiss can serve as an intermediary. The Iraqis can serve as an intermediary. And there is maybe one confidence building step as a first step that could be taken, which is the release of prisoners and, you know, held by both sides. I think as a first step, it can help break the ice. It can create some common ground, and on which maybe after 2020, because I don't think there is room between now and November 20 for the grand deal negotiation. There is a room for small step to create some element of understanding and trust, but there is no room for the grand deal negotiation. But in the interim period, between now and 2020, certain negotiations, indirectly mostly, not directly, could be undertaken, like the negotiation over the prisoners.
Well, one of the things that, well, first of all, let's go back, Tony Gosling, to what you said. You said that pretty much the path of confrontation, or the confrontational stance between the two countries, is still there. Now, based on just some of the statements made by the U.S., in particular Pompeo, and, for example, our guest there mentioned about the USS Carrier moving out of the Persian Gulf. It seems like the heat is now turned down. What do you think has led to that?
Well, there has been some diplomatic pressure of various sorts to turn the heat down. That's quite clear. But, I mean, I think the idea of trying to negotiate with the United States right now, I can totally understand why the Iranian government is thinking twice about this, because as Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said last year, the United States is simply not deal ready. You sit down at the table with the US negotiators, diplomats, whoever, and they have already decided what you will and will not agree to. So there really is no deal on the table. I think this is rather, this whole idea of having negotiations with Iran, the Americans, what they're doing is they're just posturing, simply posturing for the media, so they can say, oh, well, we tried to get a deal, we tried to get a deal. I do understand that things are not, you know, we're not getting quite close to a hot war. It's much more saber rattling. But that doesn't mean to say that there is not plans being made behind the scenes. I believe there are plans being made behind the scenes to increasingly put pressure on the Iranians. I don't think I think there's a certain unhinged aspect to the Western policy towards Iran. The Western countries, not just the US, Britain too. We seem to want to be friends with most of the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Arabia, like UAE and Bahrain. These are actually dictatorships, whereas Iran is a democratically elected government and a president. And why is it that the West seems to want to do deals with these dictatorships rather than with a democratically elected country? Let me say, I think the reason for that is mostly ideological, because they know that these dictatorships are easy to control with puppet governments, and anybody like the Russians, like the Chinese, like the Iranians, who has their own point of view, that actually decides things for themselves, is slowly but surely becoming the enemy. And they've been working up to this for a long time, of course, with the disruption in Syria and the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya and the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. There is an obsession with the Middle East, almost the same as the obsession during the Crusades hundreds of years ago. I think there's actually quite a lot of similarities between what's happening now with the creation of Israel like a gigantic fortress in the Middle East and the Crusades, the Templars, back at the European invasions of the Middle East back in the Middle Ages.
Well, one of the things that has happened this past week or so around the Slim is what Iran's foreign minister has proposed, and it is a non-aggression pact for the Persian Gulf region, in which he suggested this pact is a way of reducing tensions, and Iran stands ready to sign this non-aggression pact with some of the countries in the area. Now, there has been no response from Saudi Arabia in particular and the UAE. Iran has been used by the U.S. and some of these countries to demonize Iran, saying it supports terrorists, it's a bad actor, and it's creating instability. This sounds like a very logical approach that is non-military, that should erase any doubts perhaps that there may be. Why hasn't there been a positive response to this?
Well, the position, you're right, we have not heard yet an official reaction, neither from Saudi Arabia nor the UAE, on this proposal by Minister Zarif. But if you look at the media in both of these countries, columnists who are well known to channel perspectives of their respective governments, it's very clear that none has been well received. And the primary reason for that is that there is, how to say, confusion, not confusion, but as much as mistrust in this non-aggression pact. I mean, so the question that arises in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, according to some of the articles written in media in both of the countries, does that non-aggression pact extend to Houthis in Yemen? Does that extend to Hezbollah in Lebanon? Does that extend to the PMF in Iraq? Does that extend to the pro-regime Iran-funded militias in Syria? So when you propose non-aggression pact for the Arab countries, and here I'm not siding with one side or the other, I'm just saying, you know, what the Arab countries, I think, their take on this proposal and why their reaction is the way it is. For the Arab countries, that, you know, the problem is not as much as with Tehran per se, as much, I mean, with a confrontation between a Saudi army and an Iranian army. The problem is the policies of Tehran in the region, through the proxies, through their allies in the region, and the kind of instability that these allies have created. That's their problem. And so when Minister Zarif, you know, said non-aggression pact, I see it normal for them to question non-aggression pact involving who, what, where. And that's, I think, maybe where indirect negotiation through the help of mediators like Oman, which is a member of GCC, which is trusted by the Iranian authorities, could maybe build on this proposal. I think this, I mean, let's take it as a starting point, and let's see what the intermediaries, be it the Omanis, be it the Iraqis, being the Russians. I mean, we are not talking about the Russian, but the Russian also could be an intermediary here. What do they do about this proposal in picking it up and moving it forward toward more details? I mean, already Foreign Minister Lavrov has said this is a good first step. And I'm assuming that Minister Lavrov will be addressing this in his own bilats with counterparts in the Gulf and in other parts of the Arab region. I don't see it has reached a dead end. I think it's a good first step, but it requires a lot of discussion and negotiation about what does it mean in terms of practicalities, who is covered by this non-aggression pact, and which countries we're talking about.
Yeah, indeed. Russia actually has come out and promoted this in the sense where it is said that this is a good thing. But Tony Gosling, one of the most contentious issues, if not ranking at the top of the list perhaps, or the top three I should say, would be the issue of Palestine. The reason why I bring that up is because Iran's leader spoke about that, and he spoke about how the International Quds Day had, again, a record number of people coming out all around the world, highlighting the Palestinian cause. Now, this is something that obviously is worlds apart when it comes to the way the U.S. stands on this issue. How can there be any type of contact on this between Iran and the U.S. In general when you have such a big issue to be a stumbling block between the two?
Well, this non-aggression pact is a brilliant initiative. It's a fantastic initiative, and therefore it's hit a brick wall with most of the countries that are closely diplomatically connected and financially to the United States. But as for Palestine, I noticed that the liaison, who's Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, between Netanyahu and Trump, has just said that he doesn't believe the Palestinians are capable of governing themselves. This is the sort of attitude that we're having to deal with. We are having to listen to the highest level consultations in the United States are getting insulting advice. Of course, the Palestinians would be able to govern themselves if they were only given the chance to do so. They would very much like to govern themselves without the interference of the Israeli state. So to hear that sort of rhetoric coming out of Washington, it's not surprising that Washington is not really going to make much progress with this whole so-called deal of the century Middle East peace deal. Yet again, it's a peace process in name only. It cannot bring about peace if you're going to be insulting the Palestinians in that way and saying, well, actually, they're not capable of governing themselves. They are capable of governing themselves. They're not Untermensch. They're not lesser type of people. They're absolutely able to do that. And of course, the Palestine issue is absolutely at the heart of so much of what's been going on in the Middle East. And it's almost like the litmus test. Let us see how people react to what's going on in Palestine, and it will tell you where they really stand on human rights. For example, in Britain, our leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, is a supporter of the Palestinian cause. Therefore, the mass media in Britain is against him, and he's having attacks within the Labour Party, his own party, against him, because many believe because he supports the Palestinian cause. So that's, I think one of the major lightning rod issues, which helps you understand what's going on behind the scenes in the West with these perverted version of Judaism and Christianity, this Christian Zionism that really fuels this hatred of Muslims. And we've seen it really ever since 9/11, the anti-Muslim Islamophobic rhetoric in the West, which is given far more airtime by the mass media in the West than it should be. What we should be really looking at, I think, is the fundamentalism, the fundamentalist ideas, if you want, of people like Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. He is, I think, fanatical. He actually believes that God is on his side. He said it actually a few days ago. And that's the sort of thing I think we should be pointing out. Hang on a minute. Is God really on your side, Netanyahu? But these discussions are never had in the mass media. But you're right about Palestine. It is the lightning rod issue, which could decide everything that happens in the Middle East if the Western leaders take it seriously and get it right.
I need to cover this because it was mentioned by Iran's leader. We're running short of time. So, around Slim, I'm going to bunch these stats that Iran's leader said. Talked about how the U.S. is suffering when it comes to hunger. 41 million Americans are actually struggling with hunger and getting food on the table. He talked about U.S.'s debt being at over $22 trillion. Police brutality, how the U.S. suffers from gun violence and that a lot of deaths occur. And basically he said, go fix your own problems and stay away from Iran. Why do you think he mentioned those stats in his speech, which is not something that he does that often?
I mean, I think partly is for domestic reasons also, to tell the Iranian people that not only are we, Iran suffering from economic problems, but even the US is suffering from economic problems. I mean, if you want to put stats against stats, we can do that, but I'm not going to engage in this tit for tat stats debate here. I think, definitely the U.S. economy is the largest economy, in the world right now. Eventually, it will be surpassed by the Chinese, but it is the largest economy. We have a good level of growth, and I think it's not due to Trump's policy, but it is right now the continuation of Obama's economic policy, although we see Trump taking credit for it. But at the same time, this is an economy that is not equal in terms of its growth. I mean, more the top 5% or even 1% of the country has benefited to a greater deal than the lower 50%. That I wouldn't disagree with in terms of the inherent injustice in the U.S. economy. There is lots of problems in terms of healthcare, repairing the infrastructure. There has been a lot of debate about the need for major spending in infrastructure. That has been hijacked by the partisan politics that exists in D.C. This is not a perfect country. This is not a perfect economy, but at the same time, it's definitely, a growing economy, and it's definitely a land of opportunities. And so, so the question is, if I can comment on the issue of Palestine, I have to say that I'm speaking now from DC. The majority of pundits, especially people, analysts who have been engaged in the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a long time, are totally opposed to this deal of the century, which we know has two components, the economic component and the political component. And the driving assumption of Kushner, who really does not understand the conflict, does not understand the Palestinian people, and more importantly, does not even care about the Palestinian people and their well-being. The driving assumption is that we can bribe the Palestinian to forego their rights. If we put enough money on the table, a Palestinian cause that have been, alive and kicking for decades will just be given up by the Palestinians for them to get few billion here, or for the Lebanese to get few billion there, or for the Jordanian. And what this administration fails to understand is that there have been two tenets in the Arab world. You can never make a deal without the Palestinian approval, and you can never accept less than what the Palestinians are ready to accept.
Very well. We're going to end it there. Thank you very much for that. Senior Fellow at Middle East Institute, Randa Slim, spoke to us from Washington, D.C. And thank you, investigative journalist Tony Gosselin, spoke to us from Bristol. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kaveh Taweh, entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.